I acquired the Caldwell Estate on an impulse, one fueled by both fascination and a certain desperation. It was during an evening when I happened upon its listing, music, within the yellowed pages of an antique real estate pamphlet, discovered in the dusty, forgotten aisles of a second-hand bookshop. The property was situated in the fog-shrouded hills of Sullivan County, Vermont, not far from the dying embers of a village whose name carried the melancholy weight of abandoned hopes and prayers left unspoken, Music, Mill Hollow. Upon my first glimpse of the photographs, I was immediately taken by the severe, almost stark quality of the place. There stood a sprawling Victorian manor, tightly embraced by vines and deep shadow, its steep gables reaching skyward, topped with blackened weather vanes, music, and its windows dark like vacant eye sockets peering into the perpetual mist. But beneath that surface of obvious neglect, another quality emerged. Something that felt almost alive, breathing softly beneath the delicate, music, lacework of decay and accumulated dust. A quiet, enduring grandeur resonated with me, promising secrets both stubborn and dark, secrets that lay waiting to be uncovered. Music, I was not the sole party in this compelled acquisition. Accompanying the title deed was a dense contract, penned by hand in an ink so pale it nearly vanished into the yellowed, brittle paper. It legally and financially prohibited me, under strict penalty, from accessing a single room within the entire mansion. That room was the northernmost chamber on the second floor, a locked sanctuary that the sellers insisted must forever remain undisturbed. The clause was unsettlingly precise, a caution masked in the language of legal formality, music, yet it ignited a fierce, burning curiosity deep within me. Welcome to the Ghastly Journal, a place where we excavate the hidden pasts of locations best left forgotten. Before we venture further into the dark core of the Caldwell Estate, music, you might consider checking your own locks, ensuring your windows are securely fastened, and perhaps keeping, music, a flame burning through the night. Because what transpired after I stepped over that threshold left a mark on me that cannot be erased. And the reality, we would all come to learn, was infinitely more horrifying than anyone could have conceived. Mill Hollow exists as a tiny town forgotten by time, canopied by ancient oaks whose limbs intertwine like twisted digits against an endlessly overcast sky. The unpaved roads leading into it are cracked and stained red, choked with brambles that creep into the wide fields of derelict farms and neglected orchards, where the crisp air carries the sharp tang of an autumn evening. A profound, bone-deep quiet blankets the town, as if even the wind speaks in whispers, murmuring things better left unsaid. The residents of Mill Hollow had always maintained their distance from the Caldwell Estate across many generations. It was a place held in a mixture of reverence and mute dread, a monument to a mysterious history. The Caldwell family represented one of the oldest bloodlines in that region of Vermont. Their story, music, extended back to approximately 1832, when Ezra Caldwell, a figure renowned for his unyielding will and cold, penetrating gaze, built the original dwelling on a hill overlooking the valley. Subsequent heirs endlessly expanded and remodeled the house. It was rumored, music, each generation embedded their own secrets into its very walls, hidden corridors, concealed wall safes, locked drawers bearing cryptic inscriptions. The local parish records and old newspaper articles I examined in the dusty village archive painted a picture of alternating prosperity and tragic decline spread across the decades. Music, there were records of bountiful harvests and lavish parties, but also of puzzling disappearances, sudden, inexplicable deaths, and villagers who were never seen again after visiting the estate. These stories were not mere coincidences. They loomed over Caldwell like a black cloud, a chronicle of hidden brutality, music, steeped in superstition. I was a writer, recently exhausted by the unrelenting speed of urban existence, yearning for peace and creative stimulus. The notion of reviving a forgotten landmark appealed to me as a form of defiance against my own fading spirit. The Caldwell Estate seemed ideal, a moment frozen in time, holding a narrative that begged to be told. Walking up the wide gravel drive for the first time, the air hung heavy with the odor of decaying leaves and wet soil, a stark contrast to the musty interior, which carried the scent of cold ash and long-kept secrets. The front door groaned under my push, its hinges thick with rust from years of disuse. Inside, the house felt like a cathedral of darkness, with lofty ceilings of cracked plaster, rooms crowded with furniture draped in white sheets that stirred like ghosts in the draught, and a grand, winding staircase that snaked upwards and vanished into blackness. My initial days were spent cataloging the disorder abandoned by previous occupants, a collection of faded letters, tarnished silver, and old portraits whose eyes appeared to track me across the room. Music, yet, from the very moment of my arrival, a strange disquiet settled over me. It was a heavy feeling, difficult to define. The servants who had once lived and worked here were long gone. Yet the echo of their steps seemed trapped in the groaning floorboards. Still, the house felt as though it was being watched by something unseen. I recall the first time I detected a faint tapping, music, against a distant wall, an irregular, hollow noise that frayed my nerves in the stillness of music night. Initially, I assumed it was an intruder or an animal, but no sign of any living creature appeared. The town librarian, a thin woman named Mrs. Edith Granger, with keen eyes and a voice like rustling dry leaves, offered a gentle caution when I mentioned the estate. "Music, you are aware why that particular room is forbidden," she said, dropping her eyes before adding that the Caldwell family had kept many things locked away. Not merely objects, music, but also truths that had stained their family legacy. The architecture of the estate itself deepened the mystery. The ceilings were high and vaulted, supported by thick oak beams carved with faint, barely visible reliefs, music, of twisted human faces and thorny vines. The faded wallpaper showed pastoral scenes, but it was peeling away, revealing older layers beneath, some of which were hand-painted with cryptic symbols, music, hidden under generations of paint. The large fireplaces in the parlors were cold and seemingly long dead, yet their interiors were blackened, as if something had burned intensely within them not long ago. A narrow hallway leading to the second floor was lined with portraits of stern Caldwell men and somber women. Every painting was touched by the spreading decay. One portrait in particular drew my attention. It was of a young woman in a lace dress, her gaze fixed on mine as if silently urging me to turn back. When I inquired about her with Mrs. Granger, she merely murmured that the girl was Anna Caldwell, and that her name was never spoken aloud in Mill Hollow. The central puzzle of the estate revolved around that forbidden room, the one I was legally barred from entering. It sat at the end of a long corridor in the northern wing, just, music, below a sagging turret window. The door itself was massive oak, darkened, music, and marked with scratches that looked almost like claw marks, secured by a rusted iron, music, latch. The keys were missing, and the previous owners had insisted it remain undisturbed. But as days turned into music, nights filled with disturbed sleep and the constant groaning of the house, the room seemed to call out, making its presence felt. I could always sense it, just beyond music reach, a pressure like a heartbeat emanating from the other side of the door. It was as if the house itself wanted me to unlock it, to tear away the barriers of silence that were embedded in the estate's music very foundation. What remained unknown at that time was that beneath the proper exterior of Mill Hollow's courteous music society, there existed a shared hesitation, a silent agreement to safeguard the estate's dark secrets. The locals still told tales, music, half frightened and half reverent, about how the Caldwell family was bound by a secret curse. There were hints of inherited insanity, of rituals conducted by candlelight deep within music, the house, and a heritage of cruelty that had poisoned their bloodline with madness and hopelessness. Old music maps and surveys I found in the village archives showed that the estate was constructed above a network of underground tunnels and cellars, their entrances deliberately hidden under trapdoors and behind false walls. It was whispered that the forbidden room connected to these underground passages, serving as a portal to something else hidden far below. One evening, as a dense fog rolled like a suffocating blanket over the hills, I moved closer to the northern wing. The weak light from my lantern flickered wildly across the peeling wallpaper and uneven floors. I stopped in front of the locked door, pressing my palm against its cold surface. Through the wood, I thought I heard the faint sound of muffled breathing. I remember a primal chill crawling up my spine, as if the house itself was exhaling the breath of some long-forgotten trauma. Recalling the serious warning in the contract, I stepped back, but the overwhelming need to discover the truth continued to eat at me. Outside the window, crows had gathered in the bare branches of the oak trees. Their harsh cries cut through the silence like ancient watchers, summoned to observe what was about to happen. It was then that I found the old journal hidden beneath a floorboard in the parlor. Music, its leather cover was cracked and fragile, the pages filled with swirling ink in a handwriting I could barely make out. The journal had belonged to Beatrice Caldwell, the final matriarch, who had died under unexplained circumstances in 1928. Her words described a darkness that had spread like an infection through the family. Music, a darkness she had struggled to confine, but which had ultimately consumed her. She wrote of visions that plagued her dreams, of voices calling from the forbidden room, speaking her name, forcing her into silence. There was a repeated phrase written in desperation. "Music, do not open the door. What lies beyond will be your undoing." Yet in the margins was an inked note, dated the very day before her death, menacing and chilling. Tonight the door will open. Whether I will it or not. The house had already begun to transform me before I recognized it. The air inside felt colder, the silence more oppressive. Music, even the light seemed to bend strangely within those walls, as if time itself was hesitant to fully exist there. I decided to document everything, but regardless of how much I recorded, the music feeling intensified that I was being inexorably drawn into the narrative. Not simply as an observer, but as a participant. In that place, madness became intertwined with memory. At night, I would hear soft murmurs drifting from beneath closed doors, and the sound of light footsteps padding across the old wooden floors long after I had gone to bed. I convinced myself these were simply the noises of an old house settling, but deep down, a part of me knew otherwise. Then, one night, a whisper cut through the silence, so faint I thought I had imagined it, yet it was unmistakable. It was my name, calling to me from beyond that forbidden door. My heart pounded, and cold sweat gathered on my skin. I paused at the threshold of that door, my hand gripping the old brass knob. The chill of the metal seemed to pulse under my fingers like a heartbeat. The darkness behind it shifted and swirled like ink under glass. What they discovered behind that door, music, would change everything. Yet I remained captive to the mystery, pulled forward like a moth to a flame, music, bound by a secret older and more cruel than the house itself. The contract prohibited me from entering music, but the Caldwell Estate had already decided that I belonged inside. The deeper I dug into the complex history of the Caldwell Estate, the more the walls seemed to exhale secrets into the heavy, cold air. The house was no longer just a structure. Music, it had become a living monument to insanity, a tomb for generations bound by silence and suffocated, music, by hidden truths. The first real breakthrough occurred when Mrs. Edith Granger agreed to share, music, what she described as the town's reluctant memories. The moment she stepped onto the porch of the estate, her voice dropped to a whisper, music, as though the house itself might overhear. She told me that decades earlier, long before my arrival, the estate had been the subject of whispered rumors that extended far beyond the faded borders of Mill Hollow. There were accounts of strange visitors arriving under the cover of storms, music, figures dressed in black who would enter the estate and then simply vanish into the mist. Music, she described, almost with reverence, a secret gathering long ago, an event overshadowed by unexplained deaths, their names erased from public records and parish registers. Music, what was never said directly, yet simmered beneath Edith's calm words, was that the Caldwell family had become entangled in something that neither science nor spirituality could resolve. She spoke of a family conflict that had split the bloodline, one rooted in the tragic figure of Ezra Caldwell's great-grandson, Robert, a man whose reputation grew darker with each retelling. Robert was said to have been both exceptionally intelligent and cruel, a man obsessed with ancient rites and esoteric knowledge found in dusty books smuggled from Europe. His experiments, she revealed, had driven many servants to flee in terror, and some simply vanished without a trace. His obsession centered on the forbidden room, which he kept obsessively locked, installing a steel latch forged in the old mills near the village. It was only after music, Robert's death in 1917 that the estate fell into its long period of silence and decay. The final matriarch, Beatrice, his wife, had inherited the burden. Music, her journal stood as a grim testament to the house's descent into darkness. Edith's final words were a warning as she disappeared back into the fog that seemed, music, to envelop her village. They claimed the room held more than just memories or old heirlooms. It contained the key to the family's suffering, a presence they never named aloud, but which was described as a curse woven into the very wood and stone. Music, she gave me the name of a man who had lived his, music, entire life in Mill Hollow. He was the last surviving confidant of the Caldwell legacy. His name was Thomas Harrow, a frail man whose memory supposedly extended, music, back to the days when the estate was still filled with laughter and life. I went to find him on a cold autumn morning beneath the ancient oaks, where the fog curled like ghostly fingers around his bent figure. Thomas was something of a historian, but also a keeper of half-buried secrets. His eyes, sharp under bushy brows, darted nervously as he recounted the family's decline. He spoke slowly and deliberately, as if measuring each word against an invisible judge. Robert Caldwell had not merely studied the occult, Thomas insisted, but had, music, attempted what no person should, a ritual to summon forth what lies beyond human comprehension. This was not just superstition. It was an exploration into realms best left untouched, combining ancient rites with strange incantations discovered in a forgotten crypt beneath the cathedrals of Europe. The ritual had failed disastrously, shattering Robert's mind and placing a curse on the estate. Thomas suggested that the Forbidden Room was the site of this ritual, and had since become a kind of prison or gateway, sealing a darkness that had seeped into the very fabric of the house itself. He told me of strange sounds heard late at night by neighbors, a low wailing mixed with whispering voices that seemed to come from the northern wing. Some claimed the estate was haunted. Others feared it had become a gathering place for something far worse. It was madness given physical form, a creeping blight that could extend beyond death. Thomas had avoided the house for many years, but he still carried one relic with him. It was a faded photograph of the Caldwell children taken in the late 19th century. Their faces were unsmiling, their eyes vacant, as though, music, they carried the weight of unseen horrors. One child, a boy named Samuel, music, had disappeared in the winter of 1893, never to be found despite extensive searches. His photograph, worn and cracked, was marked with something that looked disturbingly like rust or dried blood. Thomas whispered that Samuel was last seen near that forbidden door, and that, music, his disappearance was the first sign that the estate demanded sacrifices. Music, his account sent a chill through me, confirming that the house was not merely an old relic, but a breathing manifestation, music, of something cruel and unrelenting. Yet, even as I absorbed Thomas's stories, a new thread emerged at the edge of the narrative, a subplot both mysterious and deeply connected to the house's dark core. Among the documents I discovered was a faded letter sent to Robert Caldwell from an anonymous correspondent in Europe. It was written in music, elegant, looping handwriting that suggested a scholar or occultist of considerable reputation. Music, the letter described a discovery beneath the family's ancestral home. It mentioned an underground chamber containing relics of an ancient order whose, music, practices predated Christianity. The language of the letter was chilling. It spoke of a blood-stained agreement and a warning that the house was built over a site of profound evil purpose. There was a sense that Robert had been seduced by knowledge forbidden to humanity, that his experiments had tapped into forces beyond mortal understanding. The letter referenced a sealed crypt beneath the estate, which matched the local legends of buried tunnels and forgotten cellars I had glimpsed on old maps. It argued that the northern wing, where the Forbidden Room was located, was intentionally constructed to imprison that crypt and whatever it contained. Reading these words left a bitter taste in my mouth. The house was far more than an old estate. It was a containment chamber. It was no coincidence that the contract prohibited entry to that room. It was a safeguard, encoded in ink and law, to protect any future owner from unleashing what lay beneath. I felt a thin thread unraveling inside me. A thread that connected every testimony, every document, every shadow in the house together, music, and suggested that the walls themselves were speaking in a language I was still trying to understand. The following days were marked by a growing dread that made even the familiar corridors feel foreign. Music, I spent many hours going through Beatrice's journal more thoroughly, her madness peeling away like layers of settling dust. Her entries became increasingly disjointed, music, blending a mother's grief with fear of a nameless entity beyond the door, something that whispered both promises and threats in the quiet moments before dawn. One passage described the hunger beneath, and the way it ate at her soul, while another lamented the loss of her children to the house's restless appetite. Her writing faltered near the end, with pages torn, music, and words smeared, as if her pen had trembled in terror. Yet the final note stayed in my mind. Music, the door had been opened once, just before her death. The darkness had not needed permission to awaken. That evening, as the sun sank behind the skeletal trees and cast long black fingers across the grounds, I heard the faint tapping again. Music, this time it was closer, more insistent, a rhythmic beat on the wood as if something or someone, music, was desperate to be heard from the other side. The air became unbearably cold, my breath visible in the dim light of my lantern, and the house seemed to lean toward me with a silent, malevolent anticipation. With shaking hands, I traced the scratches on the door, markings that looked more like scars inflicted by desperate claws than simple neglect. Suddenly, I was seized by a cold certainty. This was no ordinary room. It was a barrier, a prison, and beyond it lay a truth so terrible that the entire history of the estate was just a slow unfolding of its influence. But what no one understood at the time was just how deeply intertwined the horrors of the Caldwell estate truly were. My investigation uncovered another witness, a retired constable named Harold Briggs, a lean man with a slow manner of speaking, who had grown up in Mill Hollow and remembered the eerie nights when all the village dogs howled in unison and the church bells, music, rang without cause. Briggs recounted that several decades ago, following a harsh winter storm, neighbors had, music, reported flickering lights in the northern wing, shadows moving behind windows, yet no signs of life inside. He recalled a 3-day period when the estate's phone line was dead, with the house vibrating with strange hums even as a thick, unnatural fog blanketed, music, the valley. It was during those days that the earliest police records documented a series of disappearances from nearby farms. Music, young men who had gone toward the estate during the night and were never seen again. Briggs hinted that an unofficial investigation had been quickly suppressed by local authorities, music, as if the town itself had conspired to bury the truth under a coffin of silence. The deeper I went into these stories, music, the more I realized the estate represented a chronic hunger, consuming lives, devouring history, and reshaping memory with its oppressive presence. This was a place larger than the sum of its music, crumbling walls and peeling wallpaper, a living repository of fear. During one of my restless nights, while sorting through a pile of yellowed newspaper clippings, I found the obituary of Beatrice Caldwell. The text was heavily redacted, music, with black ink, a practice common for sensitive files, but the surviving words mentioned suicide by asphyxiation, attributed to an unspecified manic depression. Yet, an elderly woman mentioned in a side column, a friend of Beatrice's nurse, contradicted the official version. Beatrice had spoken in her final days of a presence in the house, a darkness she could neither name nor resist. That darkness, this woman claimed, was connected to the forbidden room. It was a confession whispered into the thick Vermont fog, and then buried with the old matriarch, as if even death could not release her from the estate's cruel grip. What they found behind that door changed everything. One evening, driven beyond reason and contractual warnings, I finally found myself searching for an entrance to the underground passages, the rumored crypt beneath the house. In the music shadowed basement, beneath stacks of rotting crates and moldering remnants of forgotten decades, music, I stumbled upon a loose tile near the hearth. The tile gave way to reveal a narrow staircase descending into spiraling darkness. The air was thick with the smell of damp stone and decay. Moonlight filtering through a cracked window above cast long shadows as I descended, my lantern casting trembling patterns on walls carved with symbols matching those I had glimpsed beneath peeling wallpaper. At the bottom of the stairs lay an iron gate, locked but rusted, music, through, and beyond it a chamber cloaked in blackness. As I crossed the threshold, a low groan seemed to rise from the depths, music, like the house itself exhaling a breath held for centuries. The walls were lined with shelves holding ancient relics, cracked urns, bones, music, wrapped in faded cloth. And in the center stood a large altar, scarred by burns and stained with unidentifiable dark patches. A frigid wind stirred the air, carrying whispered echoes that shattered the silence, music, ancient languages, sharp with menace. It sank deep into my bones that this was the place Robert Caldwell had sought. The very ground beneath the house was a tomb for those broken by the family's arrogance and the ancient power they had tried to control. The crypt was a wound in the earth, a scar on the estate's legacy that pulsed with silent malice. But the revelation that shattered me was found carved into the altar itself, a message painstakingly etched. Words carved backwards and upside down in a language I struggled to interpret. When finally translated to English, they read bound by blood kept by silence, release and fall. And beneath that, a series of names, not just Caldwell, but townspeople, employees, missing persons spanning over a century. The line between the cursed family and Mill Hollow was far thinner than I had imagined. The estate had not merely been a home or a prison. It was a conduit, a deliberate connection between our world and something else. Returning upstairs, music, the night pressed in with unnatural stillness. I understood then the full weight of the contract forbidding the chamber. It was, music, a seal, a legal and metaphysical barrier designed to protect not just the Caldwell legacy, music, but the fragile veil separating our world from the darkness beneath. What happened next defies any rational explanation. On that very night, the locked door at the end of the hall creaked open by itself. An ancient, music, breath escaped into the house, carrying with it a presence that did not belong to our realm. Music, a chilling howl rose, breaking the stillness as cold fingers of shadow spilled out, reaching with invisible claws for anything that dared trespass into the estate's fading light. No one in the town ever spoke of it again until now. Yet the most terrifying truth had yet to reveal: music, itself, lurking beneath the layers of witness and word, waiting to reshape the past in unthinkable ways. As I lay awake in the heart of the Caldwell mansion, alone except for the whispers still winding through the halls, a new understanding came to me. This estate was not simply haunted by ghosts or cursed by old misdeeds. Music, it was alive, shaped by the desires and horrors of its bloodline. Music, a dark beacon drawing those foolish enough to listen and opening its doors to stories darker and more personal than any contract or warning could contain. The Caldwell Estate was more than a property bought and sold. It was a promise, a perpetual invitation to the unfathomable, and I had just accepted the terms. The moment the door creaked open, the air shifted as if the world itself had tilted. It was a breach not just of wood and iron, but of time, space, and sanity. Behind the threshold was no ordinary room. The walls seemed to pulse faintly with a moist, living darkness, as if breathing in rhythm with some ancient entombed creature. My lantern's glow barely penetrated the gloom. Shadows swallowed the edges like ink, music, spilled on parchment. The floor was covered with rotten, warped boards that seemed damp. The air carried a sharp mix of decay and iron, like an old wound forgotten but never healed. As my eyes adjusted, I made out faint shapes pressed against the walls, faded tapestries, music, and grotesque carvings hidden beneath centuries of dust and neglect. The atmosphere was thick, visceral, and unbearably cold, pressing on my bones with the weight of countless unspoken tragedies. I found myself shivering, not entirely from the chill, but from an instinctual dread that told me I was trespassing into realms older than the estate, music, itself. Amid the clutter of broken furniture and shattered glass lay scattered relics, half-rotted dolls with glass eyes cracked and dulled by time, music, rusted tools stained with a crust of dried blood, and fragments of parchment inked with symbols that turned my stomach. These were not mere decorations, but remnants of fevered rituals. The macabre residue of a family's descent into darkness. On the far wall, barely illuminated, was a large fresco depicting a group of shadowy figures encircling a fire, their faces distorted in agony and ecstasy, their hands raised in supplication or sacrifice. It was a scene both beautiful and horrifying, evoking a sense of ceremony that had been performed here time and time again with a devotion driven by terror rather than faith. Etched beneath was a Latin phrase: music, fractured and blurred, terra tenebrae, earth of darkness. I recognized it immediately from my readings on forbidden rites. A phrase tied to ancient cults who sought communion with forces lurking beneath the surface of the world. Music. Suddenly the door slammed shut behind me, the sound echoing like a gunshot, trapping me in that suffocating silence. Panic rose in my throat and I reached for the doorknob, but it was as if the lock had frozen solid. There was no turning back. The room had claimed me as it had claimed so many before. My breath quickened. The floor seemed to shift beneath me, and I realized the walls were closing in, breathing, whispering. The nameless hunger Beatrice had written of was alive here, and it sought to feed, music, on anything that dared disturb the seal. My mind reeled as fragmented memories pressed upon me. Visions of children screaming, faces twisted in madness, of their names scrolled on the altar below, condemned by blood and silence. I could hear an unearthly chorus of voices, music, rising from the depths, a chorus that would not stop, would not rest, and I knew it was calling me, bidding me closer to the heart of the nightmare. I staggered forward, drawn by a morbid fascination that was no longer mine alone. A hidden latch in the far corner caught my eye, barely, music, visible beneath layers of grime. My fingers found it, trembling and slick with cold sweat. And as I pulled, a panel in the wall slid open, revealing a narrow stairwell spiraling downward. A foul gust escaped, carrying the stench of earth, rot, and something far older. An ancient mildew thick with forgotten sorrow. I hesitated, music, but the urge to know the full truth was overwhelming. Steeling myself, I descended into the darkness, the walls closing tighter with every step as, music, distant whispers morphed into agonized cries. At the bottom, the stairwell opened into a cavernous crypt, vast beyond expectation, and, music, etched with symbols that burned in the flickering torchlight left by some long-gone hand. The air was both humid and suffocating, dripping with moisture and centuries of suffering. The crypt floor was littered with bones, music, some human, some unrecognizable, scattered in chaotic heaps. Many were stained with a black residue that gleamed faintly under my lantern's flicker. Along the walls, bas-reliefs depicted grotesque scenes, figures bound in torment, grotesque idol worshippers in rapture, nights consumed by fire and blood. My heart thundered in my ears as the realization settled like poison. This was no mere family tomb, but a place of terrible sacrifice, where the lines between hunter and hunted had been forever blurred. A massive stone altar dominated the chamber, its surface scarred and stained, and again I saw the backwards carving from Beatrice's journal, bound by blood kept by silence, release and fall. Beneath it, the names continued, rows of etched letters spanning decades, each a testament to lives extinguished in service of an unspeakable covenant. The coldness in the chamber went beyond physical sensation. Music, it infected the mind, warping thoughts into paranoia and despair. The whispers were no longer mere sounds, but invasive thoughts, ancient appeals pleading, music, for liberation, unbearable demands masked as promises of release. I found myself shaken to the core as flashes of memories flooded, music, in, ghosts of the past occupants. Their lives tangled with madness, violence, music, and a creeping breakdown of humanity. The missing children of the Caldwell line were part of a cycle far more sinister than accidental disappearance. They were offerings, vessels for the darkness beneath. I realized that the horror was not simply that, music, the Caldwell family had touched the occult, but that they had willingly become agents of something malevolent and eternal, founders of music, a dynasty built on blood and cryptic bargains. Suddenly, the air shifted again, and the flames of my lantern flickered, music, wildly. I heard footsteps, soft, deliberate, echoing in the vast chamber. Music, my skin crawled as the shadows seemed to move of their own accord, coalescing into shapes barely human. One form stepped forward, a child, pale and spectral, music, eyes too old for youthful innocence, staring with a gaze that pierced through me. The apparition whispered a name, Samuel. He extended a trembling hand, beckoning me deeper into the crypt as if to reveal more of the estate's cursed heart. I felt the weight of his gaze, a mixture of longing and despair, and understood that the children lost to this place were trapped between worlds. Victims, yet acknowledging their own bound fate. Their spirits seemed tethered to the estate's dark soul, unable to find peace while the seal remained broken or threatened. I reached out, my hand trembling, and it was then that the full magnitude of the estate's corruption struck me. This was not merely an inherited curse or familial madness. It was an endless, grinding machine of loss and sacrifice, forged by human hands, but powered, music, by something far older and crueler. The estate had become a vessel, a living wound in the earth that devoured anyone who sought to unearth its truths. Beatrice's insanity, music, Robert's doomed ambitions, the disappearance of Samuel, the silent complicity of Mill Hollow. They were all threads woven into this tapestry of dread, music, and I unwittingly had become its latest participant. At that moment, the walls began to pulse faster, the air heavy with a sickening vibration that traveled through my spine like ice. The voices crescendoed into a roar of impossible pain and longing. I knew I had to escape before the estate claimed me as it had so many before. But as I turned toward the stairs, a fresh horror met me. Dozens of shadowy figures emerged from the darkness, circling in a macabre procession. Their faces were rotted, music, mouths agape in silent screams, hands reaching with desperate urgency. I ran blindly, my lantern swinging wildly, casting grotesque silhouettes on the stone walls as I scrambled up the stairs leading back to the cursed room. Music, the door slammed shut behind me once more, sealing the dark choir away, but leaving the echoes ringing in my mind. A heavy silence fell. I leaned against the door, gasping for breath, my body trembling with exhaustion and dread. The ancient lock rattled ominously as if the house itself breathed alongside me, alive and waiting. I was no longer certain whether I was the master of this estate or its prisoner. The truth, as it turned out, was far worse than anyone imagined. The Caldwell Estate was no mere haunted mansion. It was an altar to pain, a monument to sacrifice both willed and coerced, and a vortex where light and hope twisted into shadows and despair. What happened next defies any rational explanation. For as I stood there in the darkness, the wall beside me, smooth stone and faded wallpaper, began to bleed a slow trickle of dark liquid. The air grew thick, almost suffocating, and I knew that the boundary between the house, the past, and whatever lingered beneath was unraveling. I was caught, not by chains or locks, but by revelation that some doors once opened never truly close. I want to take a moment here before we continue deeper into this story, music, to step aside for a personal word. This channel, The Ghastly Journal, exists because of a shared passion for uncovering the hidden, the forgotten, and sometimes the forbidden. These stories, music, are not easy to tell and often come from places this world would rather leave alone. Unfortunately, the channel has recently been demonetized, which means the effort poured into research, scripting, and narrating these tales doesn't bring in income as it once did. If you're still here listening and drawn into these shadows, I want to express my genuine gratitude. Every view, every stay, every moment you choose to dive into this darkness means more than words can say. Music, if you're able and willing, there's a Ko-Fi link in the description where you can buy me a coffee. Just a small gesture that helps keep this channel alive. Even one cup makes a difference. Music, helping me to keep sharing these stories, these secrets, these truths we're not meant to know. Thank you for being part of this journey. It truly means everything. Now, let us step back through music, the threshold of that cursed room, and face the heart of the darkness once more. I returned to the main floor of the mansion, but the house no longer felt familiar. Every step echoed with a hollow finality. The portraits on the walls seemed less like paintings and more like open wounds. Music, faces that once watched silently now seemed to mourn or accuse. I made my way to the grand staircase, the sound of its creaking amplifying the oppressive solitude. I was no longer alone, though. The house whispered relentlessly. It spoke of guilt, remembrance, and the unbearable weight of secrets. My mind fractured beneath the strain. Pieces from Beatrice's journal collided with Thomas Harrow's warnings and Harold Briggs' stories until they melded into a single horrifying narrative. The Caldwell Estate was built on a cycle of ritualized violence, music, sustained by the family's darkest ambitions and compounded by a town's silent complicity. The missing, the mad, the murdered. They were all sacrifices maintaining the fragile veil between worlds, keeping the darkness chained deep beneath. But the estate demanded more than sacrifice. Music, it demanded recognition, acknowledgement, and ultimately surrender. The line that separated the living from the dead, the sane from the maddened, was as fragile as the peeling paint on the walls around me. Music, that night, haunted by these realizations, I found myself drawn once again to the forbidden room. My hands trembled as I placed them on the door, now scorched with an unfamiliar heat, as though, music, the darkness within had shifted closer to spilling out. I found the door ajar, a thin sliver of blackness leaking beyond it like ink from a wound. Hesitation, music, dissolved, replaced by a terrible resolve. I had no choice but to enter. What greeted me was a chamber transformed. Music, the grotesque fresco glistened with fresh moisture as if the past had resurrected. Shadows twisted and writhed along the walls, and at the room's center stood a figure, neither fully human nor wholly shadow, its music, form toying with the edges of my vision, hovering between flesh and nightmare. It spoke without words, and music, unfathomable presence that pressed into my mind with images of endless corridors, unspeakable acts, and the unyielding hunger that consumed each Caldwell air. My soul recoiled as memories not my own surged. Music, times and places I had never lived but now inhabited through this entity's gaze. The estate was no mere house. It was an emissary of darkness, a living psalm composed of suffering, desire, and death. Its curse was not a curse, but a call, an ancient song sung through mortal veins to draw souls back into the void. The truth I had sought was finally unveiled in a relentless torrent, and the house was hungry still. The air trembled with anticipation, and I knew there was more to uncover. Horrors deeper than I had yet dared glance into. The heart of darkness had been revealed, but it was no end. It was only the beginning. The air inside the forbidden room thickened with a suffocating weight that pressed upon my lungs and clouded my thoughts like the choking fog that perpetually hung over Mill Hollow. As I stood there, shivering and nearly paralyzed by a terror that felt both ancient and immediate. The darkness no longer seemed inert, it pulsed, music, with painful pasts and reckless desires, a living wound in the Caldwell Estate's time-worn heart. The door behind me, heavy oak and iron, was no longer a mere threshold, but a boundary between a world that should have remained hidden and the fragile illusion of normalcy I had once inhabited. Music, in that room, surrounded by the stale breath of decades, I finally understood the full reckoning the estate demanded, a reckoning not solely of history, but of human frailty and the enduring hunger for forbidden knowledge. I realized then that the Caldwell, music, estate was less a home than a crucible, a locus forged by ambition and folly, where madness, music, and sorrow merged like shadows cast by a flickering candle. The families who dwelt here, the townsfolk who peered from a distance, all had a role in the slow erosion of what was once whole. Music, the estate was a monument to secrets too terrible to name. A tomb for lost souls tethered by blood, music, and silence. Those names etched upside down and backward on the altar beneath the house were not just warnings. Music, they were legacies. Curses passed down as burdens and manifestations of a collective sin. I, music, could feel their presence around me. The ghosts of children taken too soon. The echoes of angry men who sought power beyond their grasp. And the matriarchs who tried to hold this nightmare at bay but succumbed to despair. The estate did not forgive. It did not forget. It fed. And yet the final truth was a cruel paradox. I did not feel like an intruder. The house had called me, chosen me as an heir, not of fortune, but of ruin. There was no accident in my presence here. The Caldwell legacy demanded a reckoning, and I was now entwined in its endless cycle. As I climbed the spiraling stairs from the crypt back into the cursed chamber, I knew the house was watching, waiting for me to act, to decide whether I would resist or surrender to its terrible will. The shadows had grown bold, swirling at the edges of my vision, whispering promises that twisted, music, into threats, release for those who obeyed, destruction for those who defied. Music, the choice was illusion. The house always won. Days after that night, the estate seemed to breathe around me. Windows fogged with unseen music, breath, floorboards groaned beneath invisible weight, and distant cries echoed in the depths. Sleep became a stranger. Dreams tangled nightmare with memory and impulse. I found myself wandering the halls like a revenant, feeling the pulse of the house in my veins, my reflection, music, in cracked mirrors distorted by shadows that moved independently of me. The contract's binding no longer felt like a warning but a cruel joke. Music, the estate claimed dominion over time and space here, and through me. I discovered that attempts to leave were futile. The winding dirt road vanished beneath dense, music, brambles that pricked with cold spikes like open wounds. Calls for help found only static. It was as though the house, music, had marked its territory, a realm where the outside world became a fading, unreachable dream. Amid this unraveling, I found scraps of paper in hidden compartments of the estate's furniture. More writings from Beatrice Caldwell, letters to the unknown, where desperation bled into fevered hope. Music, she spoke not only of horror, but of love lost to the house's hunger, of children stolen by the dark beneath and trapped between worlds, their souls shackled by the curse. Music, she begged for forgiveness, for release, and for someone to break the cycle that had imprisoned them all. Her words rang out like a wail across time. A plea ignored until now. It was clear the estate's evil was self-perpetuating, sustained by silence and fear, shattered only by the reckoning of one who dared to face the darkness squarely. The question that haunted me then was whether I possessed the strength to endure what I had learned, or if my fate was sealed, a new name to join the altar's cursed ledger. One evening, as twilight bled into a weeping dusk, and the ancient oak trees whispered with a language only the lost could hear, I ventured outside despite the dread knotting my chest. The village of Mill Hollow glowed with a wan, spectral light, a reminder that the estate's shadow stretched far beyond its broken windows. I stood on the music, cracked gravel drive, staring back at the Caldwell mansion, its silhouette a jagged scar against a bruised sky, and understood the haunting truth. The past was not buried beneath the earth here. It danced, music, just beneath the surface of every breath, every whispered prayer and every locked door. The estate was a shrine of endless sorrow and exquisite terror. A place where the final toll of history was still ringing, a bell that would never cease. In the depths of that night, I found myself drawn once more to the northern wing. The place forbidden but now irrevocably opened. The door I once feared beckoned with the faintest glimmer of understanding. Its dark heart no longer just a music prison, but a testament to the price demanded by curiosity and obsession. Inside, the fresco had begun to shift. Music, the painted figures moving in a slow, mournful dance, as an unseen choir hummed a requiem rising from the crypt below. The air was heavy with the scent of earth and decay. Music, but beneath it lurked a deeper note, something ancient and waiting. It was then that I realized the estate was not simply a relic of wickedness, but a vessel for a truth too terrible to be spoken aloud, that some darknesses are symbiotic, feeding on the fabric of those who inhabit them, growing stronger with each act of remembrance or intrusion. As the dreadful realization flooded my mind, a sudden chill settled over the room and the temperature plunged. The shadows around me coalesced into dim shapes, and the spectral child appeared once more. Samuel, his eyes empty yet piercing, looking past me into a realm I could not see. He whispered not a word but a gesture, beckoning me downward once again, deeper into the house's insatiable maw. My breath caught in my throat. I stood frozen, caught between despair and an unbearable compulsion to follow. The line between victim and venerator blurred, and I understood the greatest horror. The estate was a mirror reflecting the darkness within any who dared approach, demanding not only sacrifice but transformation. To gaze into those depths was, music, to stare into a fragment of the abyss within oneself. Yet even as fear rooted me, I saw movement among the shadows. Other faces, older and weary, couples and children, prisoners of time's cruel, music, cycle who lingered in twilight between vengeance and pity. Each bore the weight of forgotten sorrows, chained not by iron, but by memory and loss. Music, the estate was their tomb and their prison, their cradle and their curse. It claimed their stories and spun them into a tapestry of silent suffering, a warning unheeded by those who would tread too close to the boundary. I was no longer merely a visitor, but a witness, music, and a participant in a legacy far beyond comprehension. Tethered by blood obligations and the fragile hope of breaking, music, free. In the quiet that followed, the house seemed to sigh through its ancient bones, an echo of lives entwined, music, with tragedy and madness. And I knew that no matter what I did, the estate would endure. Its roots ran deep into the soil of Mill Hollow, and deeper still into the darkness of the human soul. Music, the contract forbidding entry, was far more than a legal barrier. It was a symbol, a safeguard, music, a desperate plea for those who came after to respect the limits of knowledge and keep, music, the door sealed for their own sake. But in my defiance, I had unleashed a reckoning not just upon myself, but upon the fragile line that separates our world from the eternal shadow beneath. Now, years after my time there, when the records were finally unsealed, and whispers became warnings, the Caldwell Estate remains, its gables still clawing at the mist. It stands as a relic and a reminder, an invitation and a prison. The town of Mill Hollow is quieter than ever. Its people aging with the weariness of unspoken truths and the heavy burden of complicity. The estate waits patiently for the next curious soul, the next descendant, the next trespasser. Music, ready once again to set in motion the endless cycle of hunger and despair that anchors it to this world and beyond. What happened next defies any rational explanation, for the estate's influence ripples still, music, touching lives and dreams. A shadow with no end. The truth, as it turned out, was far worse than anyone imagined. A darkness that never truly sleeps, only waits. If you have lingered this far, dear listener, in the shadows of the Caldwell Estate's tale, music, I thank you. This story, like so many told here on the Ghastly Journal, is a fragment of a much larger and more terrifying whole. If the tale chills your mind or stirs your curiosity, keep this place in your thoughts, and tread lightly should you ever find yourself near Mill Hollow's cursed hills. The house wants more than just to be remembered. Music, it craves to be inhabited. And some doors once open never truly close. For those who have yet to subscribe or join the shadowed fellowship of this channel, I invite, music, you to stay. Your presence, your voice, your haunting questions keep these stories alive and threading through the dark. Without you, the past would remain forever buried and these whispers forgotten. Music, this has been the Ghastly Journal. Until next time, remember that some doors are meant to stay, music, closed, and some shadows are never far behind.